following images are taken from multiple anti-globalization protests throughout Europe, the US, and Canada. As is too often the case, protests can turn into violent riots in an instant. Anti-globalization protests are no different. The images of police brutality and vandalism end up being what gets portrayed in the media, and those looking for peaceful protests and meaningful change are drowned out. The anti-globalization movement's protesting has been going on for about 20 years, beginning with protests in Madrid in 1994. However, the first major protest was in Seattle in 1999, where 40,000 protesters and rioters converged to voice their dissent against the World Trade Organization and its promotion of free trade. The next protests were in Washington, D.C. in the year 2000, where police brutality was at the heart of the media's portrayal with around 1,300 arrests in a 3-day span. In that same year, anti-globalization members converged in Prague to protest the World Bank's push for providing more power to multinational corporations. The next major protest was in Genoa 2001 because of the G8 summit being held there. This became one of the bloodiest protests in Western Europe, with many violent rioters disguising as peaceful protesters, leading to arrests and injuries of police, rioters, and peaceful protesters. After Genoa 2001, the next major protest came in London 2009 for the G20 summit being held there. The majority of protesters were there representing concern over the growing income inequality and the cost of the growing global war on terrorism. In 2010, protesters in Toronto were advocating anti-capitalism because to them capitalism is at the root of increased globalization and increased poverty. The most recent protests were in November 2014 in Brisbane, Australia, again with anger towards the increasing growth and income inequality. Now that we see not only what these protests look like, but also how often they occur, we must then look to see why this movement began in the first place. As is evidenced through their name, this is a movement that is well aware of the growth of globalization and is looking to shed light on its negativities. Globalization has led to the growth of an extremely wealthy transnational class while simultaneously creating extreme poverty for people living in third world countries. As we will see in the excerpt from Peter Kwong's lecture, there has been a growth in income and wealth inequality because of growing free trade and globalization, the heart of what anti-globalists are looking to stop.
We are basically talking about global capital. As the previous professor talked about, it's a transnational capitalist class. We are talking about the existence of a class transnationally. It's not just in the United States, in China, in Taiwan, and everywhere. Right? This is a class has been declared war against most of us. Right? That the free trade agreement signing with China is a manifestation. Basically, they have been declaring war with working people everywhere, step by step, stripping their income, stripping their social welfare, stripping their health benefits, stripping public services. All these things is happening. I mean, you live in New York City, rich people gets everything and everybody gets cuts, right?
What Peter Kwong is saying is based on graphs like this, where we see the resulting growth of the top 1%'s income at a much faster rate than everyone else. Whether you agree or disagree with the anti-globalization stance, one thing should be clear, and that is that vandalism and destruction of property through rioting is not working. For 20 years now, the anti-globalization movement has been protesting across the world in the hopes of having their voices heard, and instead the violent rioters who join in with a mob mentality are drowning them out. As a result, many news articles from these protests focus solely on the damages and the injuries and rarely talk about what the groups were there for. According to Lefebvre, capitalist space is uniform and lacking diversity because it is part of the global exchange network. In theory, Lefebvre says a movement away from globalization and towards the local use of space would push away the homogeny. This is what the anti-globalization movement tries to do with their local protests and riots. However, as we have seen, this is not working. This is because anti-globalist protests are similarly producing a sense of homogeny, of vandalism and damages, and leaders of industrialized countries no longer care. And it is precisely because of this that the anti-globalization movement needs to reform their tactics if they truly want to make an impact.